Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Nicole Parker, author of a children's book series called Tales of the Exodus. They've been number one best-selling new releases on Amazon, and they walk kids and adults through the story of the Exodus through the eyes of the children of Joshua and Caleb. The books explore how to heal from trauma through biblical principles, and there are optional questions at the end of each chapter. Nicole is a biblical counselor, speaker, homeschooling mother, and adjunct faculty member in the religion department of Southern Adventist University. In her spare time, she enjoys reading, experimenting in the kitchen, adventuring, and laughing hard. She's the happy wife of Alan Parker, a professor in the religion department of Southern Adventist University. She has a master's degree in biblical counseling from Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, and a master's degree in pastoral ministries from Andrews University. You can learn more about Tales of the Exodus series on the Tales of the Exodus page. There's a series page on Amazon. So Nicole, congratulations on all these outstanding books, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. I'm thrilled to be here.
So first, is there anything else that you'd like people to know about you besides what I touched on there?
I'm mother of four children. My boys have just finished homeschooling through high school, so they'll be starting in college in the fall. And so I have two girls, two boys. Our oldest daughter we actually adopted from Ukraine 4 years ago. No, it's 6 years ago. Almost 6 years. So she was 16 at the time, and now she's 21, doing great. So I have a lot of varied interests. This is my way of reaching out to people living out adoption, being a homeschooling mom, and then writing books on the side.
Well, four children, that just means you're busy, first of all.
Crazy busy now with all the everybody buying cars and all of that stuff. It's a new phase of life for me.
They're soon empty nesters, which I can tell you is wonderful.
That's encouraging.
So I also interviewed Nicole a while back for a book that she co-authored called The Lead Anti-Racism Challenge. So would you like to tell people about that book a little bit?
Sure. That was a great adventure. My friend Troy Brand, who is a pastor of an African American church in the area here, had asked me when we were at a vigil after the George Floyd murder. He asked me, Nicole, would you write an anti-racism pledge? And I thought, well, that's something that my kids and I could do together. And my husband, of course, is Zimbabwean by birth, but grew up there and then lived in South Africa for 10 years and actually did his doctorate on racial reconciliation issues in South Africa.
Hmm.
Churches in transition from white to multicultural. So we kind of, this is kind of our thing. And so I said, sure, Troy. And I sat down with my kids while my husband was at work one day, and we started writing. Some of their friends were here. Now, some of the time it was a little bit like writing with a bunch of monkeys in a cage. They're all jumping around and telling me, oh, say this, oh, put it this way. But we had a great time. And what we ended up with, you can see on leadpledge.org, was a pledge that people could go through of four things: listen, embrace, advocate, and dream, as sort of a ladder to anti-racism that any Christian can follow. So there's a pledge there. People can read it. They can sign it, share it with their friends. And then Troy said, hey, let's write a book. And the whole team, it was mostly people from here in Chattanooga. We were all kind of like, well, who's going to head that up? And in the end, I was like, well, it looks like it's not going to happen unless somebody does it. So I just became the editor and started recruiting friends and people from the community. And we created a 40-day journey of listening to people's stories and understanding. We divided it into the four sections: listen, embrace, advocate, and dream. So it was a great adventure. It took about 6 weeks to edit the book. And yeah, really enjoyed that.
It was a great book, and it's quite an experience for you to do that just out of nothing, right? You start from scratch. Never published a book before, never wrote a book before, worked with some people, and you had a book. I mean, that's just so
Yeah,
cool.
I had self-published some of my books before, but this was an entirely different kind of adventure, doing it,
Yeah.
editing, and I wasn't doing most of the writing. I was working with people, and then I used to proofread. I was a proofreader and editor in college. So I kind of, had the basics of that. But again, it was just a whole different animal. A great adventure. I learned so much, made some wonderful friends.
So let's get to the children's book series. As I mentioned, it's called Tales of the Exodus, and the series includes 7 books. So how did this come about?
Well, it's a funny thing. I was doing a class on the Old Testament sanctuary for my master's in pastoral ministry. And one of the assignments was to write something to help young people understand the sanctuary. Well, I said, well, that's a no-brainer. At that time, I was homeschooling my 3 kids and somebody else's 2 kids. So I thought I'll just write a story for the kids. I always loved writing, and it was just always been a passion of mine. So I wrote a story of the children of Joshua experiencing the grace of God as they were right there beside the sanctuary, going through the process of understanding how God lifts our sins off of us and sets us free. And then as we were working through the, just homeschooling initially, I sent out the manuscript to a few other friends who were studying the Old Testament sanctuary with their kids. And I got this resounding, you've got to publish this. Then as we were in the middle of the adoption process, I decided, well, we could do this as an adoption fundraiser, publish a book, even if a few of our friends buy a dozen copies, it'll help out and maybe make a difference in the world. And, and truthfully, I sprained my ankle really badly. And so I was laid up for 6 weeks on crutches and thought, well, I'll work on it then. So the Lord knew a busy mother couldn't get a whole lot of time in unless I was forced to. But it was a great adventure. I wrote the book, and then trying to publish it was another whole adventure because I didn't know you have to get an agent. I didn't know that, publishing houses wouldn't be interested. And I got back a letter from one publishing house that said, we don't really think there's a market for children's books on the sanctuary. And I was like, no, I know there is, because this is a story that shows the gospel in the Old Testament. And I know people who would love it. So in the end, then I self-published. And again, this is a lesson in privilege. If we hadn't been able to fund, the $2,000 or so it took for doing the illustrations, and in the end, it probably cost about $3,000 to illustrate, design, all of that. And if we hadn't had that, my books would never have been published. So that's a passion of mine, that those who want to be able to start but don't have the privileges that some of us have should be able to get that opportunity. I was blown away, though, when my friend sent me a screenshot the day after my book was published, showing it was the #1 new release in children's Christian historical fiction. I had not seen that coming. I had no idea. And of course, people were buying it because it was an adoption fundraiser. So I was like, well, I guess maybe, friends and then friends of friends. I don't know. I don't know who's buying this book, but I thought, well, people are donating to our adoption. That's why they're doing it. But then my professor, who had helped me all the way through the process of writing the book, he said, why don't you write one on every one of the feasts? And I said, oh, I could never do that. But I thought, well, I could write one more just on Passover because it's the same kids, just, 50 days before. So I started doing the research and writing the story of the plagues and the Passover. And after a while, I realized, this isn't going to be one book. This is going to be 4. So that's how I accidentally ended up writing a series. I wrote a story for my kids. And then I set off to write just one more part of the story, and it ended up with research being 4 books. And then, of course, I had the 4 books of their time in Egypt, and every one of them hit #1 too. And that's where I kind of started realizing it's not just that it's an adoption fundraiser. People actually are excited about the story. And once I was, 3 books in, I realized, hey, I could actually write a couple more and have it be a whole series that covers the story all the way up to where they're out in the wilderness beside the sanctuary. So that's how I ended up doing it. It took about 10 years in total to write the series because, of course, I was still homeschooling my kids and even doing my master's degree initially. So it was a lot. But, you just have to inch along at things sometimes.
Well, 10 years isn't very long for 7 books. I mean, and because they're children's book doesn't mean that they're any easier to write. I know that from talking to all my children's book author friends. So that's a lot of work, and it's wonderful that you persevered, to do that many. And what's even more impressive to me is just how well they've been accepted. As you mentioned, I mean, these all have like skyrocketed to the top of the list on Amazon. But you also shared with me before we started the interview of some of the feedback you've heard from adults, about the books. Can you share some of that with people?
Yeah, I think what first struck me was some of the Amazon reviews, some from people I didn't know who they were, and they were saying how the books were helping them. One woman said that I just started reading these books to my kids, but along the way, it started healing me from my childhood trauma. And that just struck me. And I was like, wow, wait a minute, because I realized I was really writing my own journey out of childhood trauma.
Hmm.
I mean, I've done my master's in biblical counseling, and I did that learning as I went. This is how God heals trauma. And then as I started to talk to people, people would come up to me and say, I started reading your book and it's just transformed my life. And they'd start crying and saying, this book has changed me, has changed my relationship with God. When I was in Austria last year, I had several families tell me that it had transformed their homes and their families. And they were saying, we were just reading the stories to our kids for family worship. And then as we were going through, we were like, wait, whoa, that makes sense. One woman told me that she had, for the first time in her life, finally come to realize that God loved her and received the answers for why God allowed the suffering she went through with her mother's death when she was a child, and things like that. She's like,
Hmm.
this is finally giving me a relationship with God, a real relationship with God. And another guy said he would read the book at worship with his kids and just have to stop. He's like, I just have to stop and go, wait, whoa, I've got to think. Wow, I can't even keep going until I think of how that applies to my life.
Hmm.
So that's the experience that I've seen, that I've just had an avalanche of adults telling me we were reading these to our kids and our grandkids, but along the way, we started falling in love with God like never before.
Hmm. That's so wonderful to have that kind of transformation as a result of your work. And, it's got to be both gratifying, but also talk about an example of God working through someone.
Yeah, it's amazing that God could use me. Every time I publish a book, I'm like, oh, well, maybe this one will be boring. Maybe nobody will like this one. And then, of course, I get positive feedback. But every time I have to just pray and pray, oh, Lord, help me. But, some of these moments as I'm doing the research, as I'm doing the writing, that's what transforms my own relationship with God. I remember when I finished writing the chapter where Moses is by the Red Sea and the Red Sea finally swallows Pharaoh. I finished that chapter and I just sat back with tears in my eyes like, wow, God, that is who you are.
Hmm.
And my husband came home from work and I was like, oh, you won't believe it was the most incredible thing when the Red Sea swallowed Pharaoh. He's like, that sounds a bit macabre, like, how are you excited about that? I was like, no, you've got to read it. You've got to see what it was. Like God rescued them at the last possible minute. It was phenomenal. And so experiencing the story, that's what you have to do to write it on a children's level. So I'm taking my master's in pastoral ministry and my master's in biblical counseling and putting it into chewable form so that kids can digest it. A lot of people tell me that their 6-year-olds are loving books. And I wrote them for a little bit higher age than that. But as an English teacher, former English teacher, I also surround more difficult words with words that explain them so I can build kids' vocabulary. So every book has been such a journey of just praying and saying, God, you've got to speak what people need through me because I can never do this myself.
So, in order to create the books, you had help from several archaeologists and Exodus scholars, so that the series would be as accurate as possible. Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like?
Yeah. And once again, this is where God just opens doors. Doing my master's in pastoral ministry, I met a lot of professors, as in my journey there, and some of them were able to help me with it. And Old Testament experts. And then my department here in my religion department here at Southern Adventist University, a couple of archaeologists were here. And then there was an Egyptologist also that was up in Michigan. So I would just kind of go through all of that. Now, one of the scholars, actually the one who's been most helpful to me, is Dick Davidson. And he just took such a deep personal interest in the books. So he was currently in the process of writing a new international Bible commentary on Exodus specifically. So he would send me his unpublished manuscripts of that commentary. And so I read the manuscript, write my manuscript, send my manuscript to him and to the dean of the seminary, who was one of my professors too. And they would go through it with a fine-tooth comb and say, no, 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 you can't have them on the top of the mountain here because they have to be on the side of the mountain when the water comes out because obscure verse, whatever. But it was fantastic, so I could show pictures of the illustrations to my archaeologist friend and he'd say, no, that's not quite, the period pottery would be a little bit more like this. His
Mm.
wife was also one of my close friends, my gym partner for a while, and she's an art professor who specializes in ancient pottery and all that, along with her husband. So, she would be like, no, it's got to have this pattern. It's going to be shaped like this during that time period. So yeah, a lot of revision is what that added up to. I had to write new chapters sometimes before I would publish because I'd send it to Dr. Davidson and he'd be like, well, you got to do this, here's this, what happened here. But it was so enriching. For example, in writing the part where they crossed the Red Sea, and Dr. Davidson had calculated where they went across. He said there's a shallow place there at the place where there's only one place along the Red Sea that matches the description given, where there's the mountain on one side, the mountain on the other side, the plain that's big enough for this number of people to camp there. And so he's been over all of this. He's walked this whole area. So he knows everything of this, the region. So he explained to me um, some really significant things. For one thing, that the Red Sea is so wide at that spot that they wouldn't be able to see what's going on the other side after
Wow.
they're across, which means that when it says in the Bible that the bodies of the Egyptian soldiers washed up on the shore, that means that the army was really literally almost there.
Hmm.
It was the very last minute, which is how God loves to save his people, isn't it? He gives the Pharaoh's army every bit of mercy he possibly can. The Red Sea swallows them at the last minute. And that's also important because Pharaoh, he said, would have been wearing armor, but the other Egyptian soldiers would probably not have. They would have had like a leather strap across or something, but only Pharaoh would have had armor on, which means that when the Red Sea covers them, some of the soldiers' bodies can wash up on the shore, but Pharaoh's never would. And of course, that's important because in the Egyptian religion, you had to get mummified in order to have an afterlife. There are
Hmm.
like several different things that you have to have in order to have an afterlife, like your name carved somewhere and your image carved somewhere. Well, you also have to have your body mummified in the appropriate way. And Pharaoh doesn't get an afterlife. It's a final warning of love from God to all the rest of the Egyptians that Pharaoh doesn't get an afterlife because he went after them. Some of the other soldiers' bodies they may find, not Pharaoh. So those are the kinds of details that just made the story blow my mind and come alive like it never
Hmm.
had before as a result of being able to work with these fabulous historians and theologians and archaeologists who knew all the details of everything.
Wow, that's very cool. That must have been fun to do all that
Oh,
work,
yeah.
along in parallel with the development of the book.
Uh-huh. Oh, I learned so much and I just poured into the books as much as possible of solid theology of this is who God is. This is how you can know he's a God of love.
So I understand that you're also in the process of creating some audiobooks and also building a nonprofit around this. Can you talk about those projects a little bit?
Sure. So I'm also, as you mentioned, an adjunct professor in the School of Religion here. Well, some of my students came together with me last year and said, man, you need to make your books into audiobooks. They had started doing some audiobook recording as a project on the side while they were in college. And I said, I would love to do that, but I've always thought I don't know if I want to do them just as somebody reading them because they really should be acted out. That would be so much better. And the guys are like, why don't we do that? And I was like, yeah, that's massive. And they're like, no, why don't we try it? So we ended up getting together in a little studio, tiny room like the size of a bathroom, and and trying out recording with several microphones. And we're like, you know what? We could do this. We could do this. And so that launched a whole pack of us who really had no idea what we were doing, frankly, but we've had a blast. So the local Christian radio station has given us permission to record there. We usually record on Sundays. We're about halfway through recording the books. We started in January 2024 and just not professional actors. Only one of us that's working with us is a professional actor, Jesse Rademacher, and he has done quite a bit of acting. So he's been our acting coach, and he's playing the taskmaster in Egypt. So, and that's a very intensely emotional role that frankly, I just don't know if any of us could have pulled it off. But Jesse came in at the perfect moment and he has been a lifesaver. And then one of our other friends stepped up to be Moses, Dawn Pate, with this beautiful, deep, booming voice. And then I didn't want to have a bunch of auditions, disappoint a bunch of kids and all that. So I just started thinking of friends whose kids loved my books. And we ended up just providentially coming together with a whole team, and the kids have a blast with us. We all have a blast in the studio. We laugh so much. I can't believe we get so much done when we laugh so much. But we just, we pray at the beginnings of chapters. We just have this fantastic atmosphere, no fighting, no anything, just everybody having a great time together, recording this story. One of the students, Sammy Vargas, is a music composition major. He's writing original music to go in the background of everything. Incredible. Every time Sammy goes, well, listen to this new theme I've written, I just cry. They're just so beautiful. I can't believe that God has paired me up with such an incredibly gifted musician. And we had somebody come down from Your Story Hour. Which is a ministry that creates audiobooks, these dramatized audiobooks. They've been doing them for years. I used to listen to them when I was a kid. And so my friend John Weiss came down from there and has coached us on how to do things, how to record crowd scenes, stuff that we couldn't figure out. Now, we don't have the money for the editing yet. So frankly, I haven't paid any of this acting team. Like we're all just waiting until the money comes in by faith. But we just have a great time together and pray through it. And eventually, I'm confident that the money will come in. I'm working toward getting into being a part of a ministry that would give us the opportunity to take tax deductible donations. This whole project will cost about $50,000 to edit the books. The editing is the main thing. It just costs a lot to get it to top quality that we're doing. So we have a couple of samples on my talesoftheexodus.podia.com website. If you just look up talesoftheexodus.com, it'll take you to it. We have some audiobook samples there, and we're hoping to keep putting more little tidbits of, recording from the studio as we get things done. So we've started the editing process, but we're just basically waiting for the money to come in so that we can make this happen. Eventually, I want to be able to get nonprofit status. So I have a little core admin team of 5 of us that are working together, planning things and just praying through it all. We usually just get together for a breakfast meeting every couple of weeks and talk through things, pray through everything. And just, yeah, it's a fabulous, exciting project. And listening to the story come alive, there's just nothing like it.
That's so
And
cool.
once we have it done, we can translate it using AI into languages to go around the world, explaining to people essentially why God of love allows suffering and how to trust him in the middle of it. The story of the Exodus is the story of depression at first. In the first, you know, 4 books of the story, they're still slaves. And the only way that they have any kind of hope of escape is by faith. And then, of course, once they launch out into the wilderness, now they've got anxiety on crack. What's going to happen? How are we going to get across the Red Sea? What are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? Here come the Amalekites. So the story has been so much fun to write. And the best part is when I go out anywhere and people are like, you wrote Tales of the Exodus. I love your books. They're great. My kids love them. I run into kids and they're like, we've started making a Tales of the Exodus game where we play like we're the kids in the story. Yeah,
Oh,
it's just
wow.
beautiful.
That's so cool. So what would you most like readers to take away from these books?
That understanding that God is a God of love. There is a reason he allows suffering, and no suffering is purposeless. Our lives have purpose. Moses spends 40 years in the wilderness doing a seemingly mindless job as a shepherd, and that is the way he prepares to become who God wants him to be. So sometimes we don't see a reason why we're going through what we're going through, and that's when faith actually begins. If I know why everything is happening the way it is, why would I need faith? So
Right.
the books, each one unpacks a different layer of how to trust God. I see it sort of as when you're coming to faith, it's like putting together a puzzle. You put together what part first when you're putting together a puzzle?
Usually the border.
Yeah, you put together the border. And to me, what I'm trying to do is build a border with people. The book one, Faith Roots, is about why a God of love allows suffering, how to trust him in the middle of it. In that, I'm putting together a border saying, if the universe was created by a God of love, if he loves us and has a plan for our lives, which is what the Bible says, then that is the border of our lives. And everything else in our life is putting in the pieces of the rest of it. And then I continue through the series, adding more pieces, seeing, okay, first of all, we have to trust that God is a God of love when we don't see that. And book one is just the story of when Moses comes back to Egypt. He says, God's going to set you free. Well, God doesn't set them free at all. Pharaoh takes away the straw. Their leaders get whipped. And at the end of it, they learn to trust God in the darkness as well as the light. He hasn't yet delivered them. They haven't yet seen the plagues. And so that's my border. God is a God of love, and we must trust him to be who he says he is. Then book two builds on that and shows how God uses power. So that book is called Humble Stones. And essentially, I'm showing how Pharaoh uses his power to crush down everyone. But the reason the universe is safe is because the God of the universe is exactly the opposite. He always only ever uses his power to lift up those who are weaker than him. That's why the universe is safe. And Pharaoh is an example of who the enemy is, who Satan is. So I use book two to show this is why we can trust God because of how he uses power. And I use it in the first 3 plagues. Then the next book, Wings of Love, unpacks the the theme of why God's love is the perfect blend of justice and mercy. And God carefully plans how much justice, how much mercy to give in every situation in every person's life. So that book goes through the next 4 plagues and shows essentially God's loving kindness is the perfect blend of justice and mercy. Then book 4 builds on what we've learned about the character of God in the first 3 books and says, based on this, we can trust God and forgive others. So in book 4, I have the children of Joshua and Caleb forgiving the son of the taskmaster who has bullied and harassed them the entire time. They have to forgive him and work to save him from dying in the Passover plague at the end of book 4.
Hmm.
So that those 4 books cover Egypt, their time in Egypt, and learning to trust God while they're still in slavery. Then, of
Wow.
course, I moved on from there. In the next three books, I talk about, crossing the Red Sea, getting the manna out of the water from the rock, learning who God is when we don't know what's predictable. At least in slavery, everything was predictable. You knew where you were going to be tomorrow and every other day. But in the wilderness, they have to learn how to make choices. And in our wilderness times, sometimes it's going to be difficult to make choices. We won't always have a cloud blowing overhead, but God will guide us. And so I walk them through all of that and, Ten Commandments, the priesthood of all believers, the golden calf and learning the gospel. Essentially, the sanctuary in the wilderness was God giving the message that his son was going to die for their sins someday as the lamb before they ever even knew anything of Jesus. And so that message I felt was so crucial to show. Even in the Old Testament, God was a God of loving kindness, and he was rescuing them even when they didn't understand him yet.
So you've been basically an entrepreneur now for several years doing all this work. What advice do you have people who are just now considering going off on their own to launch something new?
You know, I wanted to be a writer ever since I was 5 years old. It was always my dream. I just didn't have the courage. I didn't believe that anybody would listen to me. And when my first book was published, I still was just like, but surely nobody's gonna, like, they're just buying it out of charity, right? And then all the reviews started flowing in. So Sanctuary Light, which is book 7 of the series, was actually the first one I wrote. And that one is the one that has the most reviews, whereas I wrote Desert Glory and Mountain Majesty last. And Mountain Majesty only has a few reviews on Amazon. So people are welcome to go and finish that. But, as I saw, people really were genuinely being blessed through something that I was so, full of trepidation as I thought of trying to do it. It just gave me such courage. God can use somebody like me. He can use any of us. In fact, he loves to use the weakest and the humblest because then we're less likely to let it go to our heads. And until we know that God can do something with nothing, we really, you know, we're always going to be either thinking more of ourselves or less than ourselves. Either we think, I don't need God's help, or God can't do something through somebody like me. And he wants us to have that balance where we go, I can't do anything on my own, but with God, I can do anything he calls me to do. So that's my encouragement to people. Not every idea needs to be brought to fruition. Some of our ideas just, aren't going to make it. So I think it's also important to bring our idea before others who care about us, others who will be honest with us, and, have a team. That's been so helpful to me. I have friends who read the books along with me, after I've written a manuscript. I have several people who say, me, I'd love to read it. And they'll give me their feedback and say, hey, you have a character pop up here that you didn't give an introduction to. I'm like, oh, you're right. I moved that from this other chapter and forgot. So you need a team. You need a network. Don't try to just launch out all by yourself unless that's really what God calls you to do. But that's been very helpful to me, having my husband read my books, having my kids read with me, having friends who will be honest with me, and people who have helped out financially, particularly with the audio books. We have a sponsorship kind of, where people are signing up to sponsor $9 a month or $100 a month or whatever. And that's been hugely helpful. So I think this is the thing. If God puts a vision on your heart, talk to other people around you, people who you respect, people who love you, get some honest feedback, and don't just do it by yourself. But when you have a calling and you have a passion, don't be afraid to step out in faith.
It's all such excellent advice. I totally agree and totally support what you're doing. Um, so Nicole, congratulations. It's so wonderful to learn about all of this, and very happy for you and for how you're going to impact people in such a positive way. Um,
Yes.
again, the title of the book series is Tales of the Exodus. You can learn more on the series page on Amazon or talesoftheexodus.com. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that will take you to the page. I'm actually working on writing Tales of Canaan now. So the
Hmm.
7 book Tales of the Exodus get them out into the wilderness, into the sanctuary. Now I'm doing 3 book just to get them into Canaan. I want to show that this wasn't a genocide at all. When they conquer Canaan, it is not a genocide. And the Bible is very clear. And if you understand the archaeological evidence and the other things that were going on behind the scenes, it all makes sense. So again, the puzzle edge is that God is a God of love. But I think there are a lot of good questions that people have, valid questions about what happened in the conquering of Canaan. So I'm going to be writing that. And then I'm already planning my next series after that on the story of Jesus. I
Hmm.
am just
Good. I was
binging
wondering
on,
about that.
yes, I love it. I'm binging on the Gospels in preparation already. I've been going over and over the story of Jesus, and the story's coming together in my mind already, the children in the story. So again, I'm writing everything from the perspective of the children, but the lessons I'm writing are the ones that I needed as an adult and that other adults need to know how to love God, how to trust him with our lives. And I'm just trying to put it into a chewable form that people can binge read and love. I mean, at the end of each chapter, there are like the thought questions. I would like to create more resources for adults, for journaling, for working through things as they're going through the books. I have a friend who is working on creating a curriculum for kids to use for homeschool or for teachers. I have several friends who are teachers who are reading through the books with their students as well and tell me these wonderful stories. I had a teacher send me pictures a couple months ago when her kids reached this exciting part of the story where someone's life was transformed. And she sent me pictures of all her 6th graders crying and then laughing because they were crying because they were so excited about what had happened in the story. So
Hmm.
that's my vision, helping people understand who God is in deeper and better ways all the time.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, again, Nicole, congratulations and thanks for sharing all this about your books with us.
Thank you, Brian. I really enjoyed having time to talk with you, and I look forward to seeing how the Lord leads in the future.
Amen. Thank you.